Greetings, future diplomats. Welcome to our fifth class of our TPS exercise course. This week we have two more questions, right? And this week we will focus on our themes regarding art. Uh, the first one talks about art in its literary form, about poetry, and the second one talks more about art in the pictorial sense, in the sense of rule breaking art. Talks about a group of outlaws who 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 are artists in the street art gangs in Japan. And in this article specifically, it's from the 2012 TPS. It talks about a group that went into the Fukushima power plant after the disaster in 2011 and tried to make their art installations there and all of the repercussions that happened because of it. Two very interesting articles. Okay. Now, getting right down to it, the first article is let me share it here with you guys. Just one second. The first article is an op-ed piece from the New York Times, and it's about a new way of thinking about poetry. More often than not, we are taught in classrooms and in higher education courses that poetry, the harder the language, the more twisted the syntax, and the more complex the imageries and the metaphors used, the more interesting or the more intelligent the poem is, oh, and the more useful it is as a work of art. And this author here tries to demystify this view. He he makes a point of saying that uh, art, poetry, is not about using hard words, but it's about creating. It's about taking the reader away and creating new landscapes and new ways of thinking language by using common language, language that you use in your everyday lives. And using common language does not disqualify a poem. Actually, it can make it stronger uh, because you have readers who can relate to it and create new imagery from it and create new meaning from it. And that's the most important part of poetry. It's this new meaning. It's creating this true sense of strangeness that we have by reading a poem that takes us away from our daily lives, but using our daily vocabulary. So this is an interesting take on uh, on poetry, all right, and this literary art. Okay, so getting right down to it, the first question that we have here is: according to the text, decide whether the following statements are right C or wrong E. All right. Item number one. Item number one is strictly uh, vocab question. Is testing your vocabulary, and these two words here, the word pervasive and ubiquitous, have been used in past TPSs to create some discomfort in a few candidates. Okay, so let's read. The word pervasive in this attitude is pervasive, written in bold type, could be changed to ubiquitous without affecting the meaning of the sentence. Okay, so at first glance, you would say yes, well, they do have the same general meaning. If you look at a dictionary, it's hard to find the difference, but they do have very different connotations, although they have the same general idea. Uh, if you look at pervasive has that idea of something that came from a singular point that is diffused through a medium. That's in more scientific terms. In terms of information, you can use that a certain information or opinion was diffused through social media or media in general and reached everywhere. Okay, so it started from a point, it had this action of diffusing. Ubiquitous, on the other hand, has the idea of it already existed everywhere. So it's always been there and it's always been everywhere. So it has that slightly different connotation, different meaning. And unless it's these two words are preceded by a prepositional clause, which gives it more that general idea, then they do not have the same meaning. They will affect the meaning of the sentence. They cannot be used interchangeably. And this has also been the position of the examining board. Uh, uh, I don't remember from when this particular vocab question was from, but it was 2010 or 2011. They used a similar question where they used these two vocab words and they were not used interchangeably. And a lot of candidates were confused because they are so similar. But if you look at the notes and both of their actual definition, they are different and they cannot be used interchangeably. Okay? Question one, item two. According to the author, so you already know it's a reading interpretation question. Um, One of the big hurdles for young poets is to make poems meaningful through meaningless language. Uh, and in this item, I tried to confuse you guys a little bit to confound using contorting language. Um, uh, I tried to do exactly what he accuses young poets of doing, was trying to use uh, uh, alliterations and difficult metaphors to try to create a deeper meaning where there is none. And here, this is not what he says. He actually says the opposite. Uh, he doesn't want poets to use meaningless language per se. He wants poets to use everyday language, mundane language, language that used colloquially by everybody, so they can relate to it more easier, more easily, and not use meaningless language per se. Of course, he doesn't want you to use hard language, tough. He wants you to use. Uh, he wants you to use more, more. He wants you to use more common language to the common man, to relate to the common man. Okay. All right. Now getting back here. Okay. Number three, the idea that poetry requires a formal education to be understood takes readers away from the real meaning of poetry. Uh, and this is one of the points he was trying to make. So this one is correct. The author of this interesting piece here uh, says that poetry is something organic, is something that you, anyone, anywhere, can read a piece of poetry and feel something from it, gather something from it, gather meaning from it. You don't necessarily need to have that formal education that tells you, oh, so in order to read a poem, you have to do A, X, B, Z, Z, D, all follow all the steps correctly in order to read a poem correctly. No, he said that the poems are more organic than that. They come from everywhere, and every aspect of life is uh, a legitimate uh, uh, legitimate supplier of good poetry. So you don't necessarily need a formal education to understand poetry. 4. Some poets have an unconscious tendency of avoiding giving basic information to somehow create a hidden meaning in their work. And this one is also correct. This is one of the pitfalls, again, that the author of the text uh, is warning us about. That because of our education, because of what schools teach us, because of what we taught in higher education courses, that the harder the better, the more complicated, the more confusing, the more intelligent the poem is. Uh, some poets have this unconscious tendency of not giving basic information like who, what, when, where, who is talking, who's talking. They leave it. sometimes very open, very ambiguous, in order to create this sense of complexities in their reader, when actually what all they're doing is confusing their the reader, and not where they cannot take anything from the work, and they have this idea that having a hidden meaning behind their work also makes it more intelligent, which is also not the case. Sometimes you need basic information. There's no shame in giving basic information, and it doesn't disqualify your work again just by giving basic information. Okay? So here recapping. Question one. Item one is incorrect. Item two is incorrect. Item three is correct. Item four is correct. Okay. Moving on to question two. Based on text one, decide whether the following statements are right or wrong. These question headers this week are not as hard as the last one. They're very generic. So enjoy. Question two, item one. In a poem, language should be sanctified in order to convey its precise meaning to the reader. This one is incorrect. Should be sanctified gives the idea that language shouldn't be changed at all. That language should be left in a glass case. It shouldn't be touched. And this is not what he's saying. Here I was trying again to confuse you guys, because he uses the word here. Where is it? He uses the word here. In a poem, language remains itself, yet it also made to feel different, even sacred, like a spell. Okay, so the sacred here is not the same sense as sanctified, and in the sense of becoming static. It's in the sense that the words are there, they have their meaning, and here he's in favor of using simple language and literal language, not using metaphors all the time. But at the same time, it has its original meaning that one can easily identify. It also can make a person feel different, and the language itself can feel different to each person who reads it. So it's even more complex than just writing a hard to decipher sentence full of metaphors. It's using simple language that has a very straightforward meaning, but at the same time, and can create different meanings to different people. Okay, and this is how to create a very fulfilling poem in his opinion. Okay, he doesn't say anything about sanctifying language in order to convey its precise meaning to the reader. Okay, there's a different action that happens. Using language, even literal language, even having a very straightforward meaning, it can also create different meanings for different people. Even though you have a word as simple as ball, as simple as tree, a tree can have a different meaning for each person. Okay? So this is what he's saying. And number two is exactly what I was saying. Sometimes in the TPS, they do this. They have a item which answers the other item. So one that contradicts the other item. So sometimes if you get one item, you can get the other one very quickly. If you don't understand one item, it's going to be very difficult to understand the next one, and you lose half a point almost. So in this case, this one is actually trying to say what the first one wanted to say, but said it incorrectly. This one is actually what the author said. He gives the general idea in his text that poetry can give new meaning to seemingly mundane language. And this is exactly what he says there in that same sentence that I read to you. In a poem, language remains itself, yet it also made It's also made to feel different, even sacred, like a spell. So language remains itself. Uh, language, poetry can give two meaning to seemingly mundane language, simple language, to language that is straightforward. And poetry can give you a new meaning, almost like a spell, like a sorcerer's spell, or something like that. Okay. So, in this sense, poetry can be very interesting without being very difficult. Three, some poets feel obliged to spurn information in an attempt to create an intricate and in-depth work of art. And this was a reading comprehension question mixed in with a vocab question, which sometimes does make an appearance, these types of questions in the TPS. They test two things at once, so be prepared for that as well. In this case, I was trying to test you with the word spurn. The word spurn meaning to divulge, uh, they, or actually the opposite, they felt obliged to withhold information. Okay, this goes back to the idea that that they unconsciously attempt to withhold basic information from the reader because they want to create mystery, an artificial mystery. They want to make their work seem more in depth, more complicated than it actually is, uh, because in an attempt to be seen as a more intellectual author. So this one is correct. Some poets feel that they're obligated to just to avoid giving basic information because it would make it too easy. Sometimes even some film directors do this. Uh, they they cut scenes or they cut narrations, especially of their movies, because they think they give too much information away. They make it too straightforward for the audience, and that will remove the depth of the work. In some cases, they're correct. In some other cases, they create a more confusing movie, uh, which it makes it less appealing to the viewers if than if they would just divulge the basic information and I try to create this artificial depth to their work. Okay. Item number 4. The author, it could be argued, has a bottom up or bottoms up approach to writing poems. Okay, this one I was trying to work with the idioms and bottom up, meaning that he has a different, unorthodox view of how to write a poem. Uh, he starts by looking at the words themselves and then moving on to the bigger ideas, as opposed to what you learn in usually learn in school or in literature class, that poems start with great ideas and then you go down and work each word. Okay. Here he's using the power of the actual word, uh, and then from the word work your way up to bigger ideas. So he works from the bottom up, not top down, as usually you're taught to work uh, as a poet. Okay. He has a passage here. I'm trying to find it. Yeah, I can't find it at this moment. Where is it? But it gives you the general idea that this is how you start from the word, and then you go to greater ideas when you're writing the poem. Uh, and from the most literal, more simple words, you can get great ideas. You can cause great emotions and great reactions in your reader. There's one emblematic sentence here where he conveys that idea. Uh, that creating mystery. Here. But it turns out that the portal to the strange is the literal. Okay, so the portal to new worlds is something that you're not used to, some different emotion that a poem can conjure up inside of you. Comes not from difficult words, but from actual the literal original meaning of words, from straightforward words. From even from the most simple words, you can get this. You can engender this reaction in people. You create the sense of strangeness, which poems usually do. They take you away from your regular state of being. Um, from the regular, even using normal simple words, you can take the reader into a different realm of literature. Okay, and they create the sense of strangeness. Strangeness in the sense that they take you away from your habitual use of language. Moving on to question 3. Based on the text, judge right or wrong. Even though young poets are affected by the deceitful postulations about poetry, they can more easily discover the true nature of this literary art. And this one is incorrect. The first part of the sentence could be considered correct. Young poets are deeply affected by these misinterpretations of what constitutes a good a poem. Uh, they are trained by their professors, their teachers, and how to read poetry and how to make a quote unquote quality work of poetry. And their work, they suffer in a vicious cycle of trying to make even more complex poems in order to be more intellectual, in order to get more readers, in order to get more respect, and they create these vapid and superficial poems which sound very, very, very difficult. But actually, when you get to the bottom of it, they are almost meaningless. They don't convey the real emotion of the poet. Okay. So in this sense, this up to the comma is correct. But then this, you cannot assert this from the text, that they can more easily discover the true nature of this literary art. This is not said there, that they can more easily. They should discover the true nature, but it's not said in the text that they can more easily than, per se, older poets to discover the true nature of this literary art. Not necessarily. It could be easier for them because they have been writing for a lesser time, so they're less contaminated uh, by this way of of teaching poetry. But also they might be inexperienced and might want to break uh, into literary fame, that they are willing to follow the traditional views of poetry. So they'll be even harder to change their views on poetry. So it's difficult to say it. Not because he's younger that he's going to be easier to change his way of viewing poetry. Not because he's older that it's harder for him to change. So this is not said in the poem. Okay. Item number 2. Poems find their meaning in the mysteries that they organically create for the reader. Okay. And this one is correct. This is exactly what the author of this op-ed piece is trying to say. That poems find their meanings and mysteries organically, and not when you ham fist hard vocabulary or hard syntax into your work of art, or if you create artificially ambiguous texts just to make it harder for the reader to understand. Will you create a meaningful work of art, well, a mysterious work of art? The mysteries are created organically by the way you use the words, by simple words, by just conveying your true nature on the page. You can create very great mysteries. by using simple language. And this is the theme throughout this article. Okay, so yeah, so correct. Question number 3, item number 3. Uh, words used in their literal sense can engender strange emotions in some forms of poetry. And this is correct. This is what I was saying before, right before. Uh, the most literal word can have different emotions and can create different reactions in different people. And strange, you're not in the meaning of weird, but strange in the meaning of uncommon. So it can take a person away uh, from uh, uh, from their common interpretation of language. Okay, like for instance, the word tree. You can use tree in a sense that will give you a new meaning for the word tree, but just using the word tree, conveying a different view of tree, transforming the tree into a person or into a tree into an idea instead of just a plant. You could create a strangeness of the meaning of the word tree in the reader. Okay, so this is what he's saying. You can still use the word tree in its literal meaning, but then play with it a little bit. 4, the author shuns the idea that the quality of the poem should be measured by its ability to confound the reader. And again, this is just a rehashing of the same theme that we're going through here. That the author shuns, he's very against the idea that a quality poem should be measured by its ability to confound the reader. So you don't have to use hard words, use complicated words, and your reader ideally doesn't have to be confused in order to prove the quality of your poem. To the contrary, here he says that the reader has to be really affected by your poem emotionally and filled with new ideas and new meanings of his own about your poem. And in order to do that, he needs to understand your poem. So if he doesn't understand your poem, there's no sense in writing the poem. Okay. Now here changing to text 2 for questions 4 and 5, we change from poems and literature here to more the graphic arts. Okay. And here, as opposed to the other one where you have schooled artists and artists with formal education, here you have a gang of unschooled artists who are breaking the rules and bending the rules in a very traditional society, uh, which is Japan, where breaking the rules is frowned upon. Okay. So here is the opposite of the other ones. Here you have artists who inherently do something against tradition and against uh, the 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 status quo. Okay. All right. So let's get down to it. Hopefully you read this text already. Um, so question 4 is from the 2012 exam. I have adapted a little bit, changed a few of the items in order to make sense in my exercise. Based on the text, judge right or wrong the following items. Here we go. Toshinori Mizuno was more concerned with the radiation he was exposed to while he was at the nuclear power plant than with the fact that his art challenged the Japanese established rules. And that is incorrect. That is not the case at all. The whole text is talking about how in Japanese society breaking the rules is more shamed on. People are more scared of breaking the rules than of even being intoxicated by radiation, such as in Fukushima. And here he says it right here. Bending the rules, let alone breaking them, is largely taboo in Japanese society. That was breaking the rules was the one reason Tashinori Mizuno was terrified as he worked undercover at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, trying to get the shot that showed him in front of the mangled third reactor holding up a referee's red card. Okay. Uh, he was also terrified of the radiation, which registered its highest readings where he took the photograph. The only reason he did not arouse suspicion, he says, is because he was in radiation kit. And in Japan, people rarely challenge a man in uniform. Okay, so that idea that the rules are sacred, breaking the rules is very taboo in Japan. So here, he doesn't say he was more concerned with the radiation. Here, he said he was equally or even more concerned with breaking the rules than with the radiation. So this is not correct. Right. Sorry, here we have a phone call coming in. Be back. All right. Okay. Moving on to item number 2. Some Fukushima Daiichi employees have have turned into political activists after the accident of 2011. And this one is incorrect. If we look, radiation it says nowhere that the officials in the Fukushima power plant station turned into activists. It says that the artist here, Mr. Mizuno here, was wearing an official uniform, but he was not an employee of the power plant at all. He was part of this street art gang, and not one of the official workers. All right. And here they're trying to confuse you because they use the expression as he worked undercover at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. He wasn't a worker there. He was working undercover because he was using the uniform, pretending to be a worker, but he was not an employee. So nowhere here does it say that an actual employee of the power plant turned into an activist. He was the activist photographer who tried to take photos from inside of the dilapidated reactor. The Japanese in general are enthusiastic about artists who get in trouble for breaking the traditional dogmas prevalent in the artistic milieu. Milieu from the French, yeah. And that's quite the opposite. Here, we're already in the first sentence. In Japan, there's no kudos in going to jail for your art. Bending the rules, let alone breaking them, is largely taboo. That was one of the reasons that Shori Mizuno was terrified as he worked undercover at the Fukushima power plant. Okay. And in Japan, people rarely challenge a man in uniform. Okay. So in Japan, everybody is very, very frightened of bending or breaking the rules. So they're not very enthusiastic about artists getting in trouble and breaking traditional dogmas prevalent in society. So this one weaves in very nicely into the fourth item, which says that in Japan, there's no shame in going to jail for your art. Contrary to some Western countries where if an activist goes to jail for its art, for his freedom of speech, is seen as something brave, something bold, and something to be praised upon. In Japan, no. In Japan, there's no praise in going to jail for your art at all. There's no praise in going to jail at all. There's no praise for the rules are king. You cannot break the rules. It's more important to follow the rules then pursue your own agenda there in Japan. So here I was trying to work more with the vocabulary using the word kudos, which is a word that usually used in more informal settings. Kudos in the sense that you get respect, you get street credibility or street cred. If you break the rules, you're seen with respect among your peers, especially if you're from part of the street art group, as this one collective, as this one. You will get respect from the art community and from society if you break the rules in this sense to express your art. Uh, and in Japan, no. In Japan, it's it's largely seen as taboo if you break the rules, even if you're defending your own art, if you're expressing your own art, and being an activist, showing uh, the real situation inside the Fukushima reactor, and holding the government accountable. Okay. And last but not least, question 5. The words mangled and suffused, both in bold, can mean respectively ruined and permeated, mutilated and obscured, subdued and covered, and contorted and steeped. And if we go back to it, both number 1 and number 4 are correct. The word mangled means ruined. If you mangled something, you ruin it, or you contort it, twist it, you ruin it. It's no longer usable, so it's mangled. Is usually the expression. It's a mangled mess, meaning that it's beyond use. It's been wrecked beyond use. And the word suffused, which means something's permeated by something, suffused with something, or steeped in, has that same meaning. When you're steeped in something, you're full of something. You're permeated completely by something. And since these two being the same, item 1 and item 4 means the same thing as the header of the question of mangled and suffused, ruined and permeated, contorted and steeped. The word mutilated does not necessarily mean mangled, because mutilated can still be in use in some sense. And the word obscured is just the complete opposite, almost the opposite of permeated. Obscured is not the same meaning. If you're obscured by something, it doesn't mean that something is in you. And if it's covered, again, it not necessarily means that you're permeated with, because permeated and steeped it's almost the same meaning as pervasive. It's diffused with something. It's almost capillarity action happening. Something permeates you. Is not cover you. Cover you is on top of you, and permeate is within you. Okay, it's suffused within you. Almost the same as seeped. Okay, and obscured is the same almost as covered. Again, you're covered with something. It's not in you per se. And subdued does not have the same meaning. A subdued means it has like you had a subdued response. You had a less emphatic response as we would think you would have, a less aggressive, so a more softer response to something. So subdued. So it doesn't have that meaning of mangled. Okay. All right. And so recapping, we have item 1 is correct, item 2 incorrect, item 3 incorrect, item 4 correct. Okay. Always, again, when they have vocab words like this, always check the meaning in the dictionary. Go through the dictionary, go to Cambridge.com or go to any Webster's Dictionary.com and look at the other synonyms of these words and try to create your own vocab quiz and your vocab test. Look at these words again and try to look at all the possible combinations you can have. It's impossible to memorize all the words in the English language and their synonyms and antonyms and everything else. but it's just good to create that baggage. Sometimes you might get lucky in an exam. Okay, so I will see you guys next week for a 6th exercise, and until then, keep on studying. We're almost there, I think. All right, thank you very much, and until next week.